Marco Rubio, former Speaker of the House of the Florida House of Representatives, now running against Charlie Crist, until recently one of the more popular governors in the history of the state of Florida. But now Charlie Crist is in it for a fight of his political life against Speaker Rubio. Speaker Rubio, thanks for being with us on the Joe Scarborough Show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. By the way, headed today to your old stomping grounds there in Northwest Florida.
That's awesome. Hey, does my story sound familiar to you?
Does what? Yeah, your story sounds like pretty encouraging. I'm glad I heard it this morning. It gives me, although I was familiar with it, we've got a lot of common friends, so I was familiar with that story, but absolutely.
Well, they're doing the National Republican Party. Look what they're doing up in New York 23 right now, endorsing a woman that supported card check, that supported the Obama stimulus package, and also that was far more liberal than a lot of Democrats in the New York legislature.
Yeah, you know, I've been so wrapped up. I mean, I've seen the headlines. I've been so wrapped up in our race that I haven't followed the details of it. It looks like it's getting to be pretty messy. Look, I don't know what this obsession is or if there's something programmed in the DNA of Republican establishment folks about this kind of thing, but in my mind, and I said it earlier today on the TV show, is that this country already has a Democratic Party, and Americans who agree with that view of government have an option already to vote for. The rest of Americans, what I even think is the majority of Americans who don't view government as the answer to all of our problems, deserve to have voices in politics, and I think that should be the Republican Party. And quite frankly, when we are about those things, that's when Republicans win, and when they're about anything else is when Republicans lose.
Well, but why have you talked to the National Republican Party? Why are they against you?
You know, I think it's largely a function early. Two things I think have happened. This decision was made earlier in the year when there was still kind of this sense that the future for Republicans was to be more moderate, more middle of the road, that the country had fundamentally changed and that Obama was the beginning of this fundamental change in the way Americans viewed government. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is, to be quite frank, is pragmatic, is this idea that Charlie Crist could raise all this money on his own and so they wouldn't need to spend any money in Florida and could use those resources elsewhere.
Well, Charlie can raise a hell of a lot of money, can't he?
Yeah, he can, but here's the deal. I think so can we, especially if we had the support of establishment individuals and if we had the help of the party unified behind us. Look, I don't think there's any Democrat running for the U.S. Senate in Florida that's unbeatable. In fact, Rasmussen poll last week showed that I beat Kendrick Meek, who's the front runner and probably the likely nominee for the Democrats, by more than Charlie Crist does. I beat him by 16 points. So, and that's the second poll that they do that shows that. So I think that argument is flawed and has been disproven at this point.
Yeah, we are talking to Florida's former Speaker of the House, Marco Rubio. He is running against Governor Charlie Crist for the U.S. Senate next year, and it is a race that Red State, Eric Erickson at Red State, has told fellow conservatives is a hill worth dying on. Have you gotten a lot of conservative support from across America? Is this turning into a national referendum on the party establishment?
You know, I think it takes time, and I really don't want it to be a race against the party establishment. I want it to be, although I think that's what may motivate some people, but I certainly want it to be a race where we can prove that, you know, center-right mainstream conservatives can win in states like Florida.
But the party establishment, Speaker, the party establishment is trying to kill you.
Yeah, I understand, but look, here's the bottom line. First of all, I think it does disservice to folks like Jim DeMint and Senator Inhofe and others who are supporting us, Dick Armey, you know, Congressman Jeff Miller from, I think, is your successor, and others who have lined up behind me. And I think to some extent they're going against the party in that regard. But the reality of it is that I always tell people, if you're unhappy with the establishment, whatever the establishment may be in any given situation, let's get a new one.
Yeah.
Let's get a new establishment. Let's redefine our party so that it once again becomes a consistent voice for Americans that do not believe that government should be picking winners and losers in our economic lives.
We're talking to Speaker Marco Rubio running against Charlie Crist, Governor Charlie Crist. In a Republican primary, this is going to be a bellwether for the Republican Party, which direction the National Party goes in the future. This is what I don't get. John Cornyn, who is running the Republican Senate Committee, is one of the most conservative members in the United States Senate. And then on the House side, you've got Pete Sessions, who's a very conservative Republican, running the NRCC. But in both cases, Pete supports the liberal Republican in upstate New York, and John Cornyn, a very conservative guy, is not supporting the conservative Republican in this race. Isn't that kind of confusing to you, and also confusing to conservatives that contribute to national Republican institutions.
You know, I think you see the irony in it as I do, and obviously, all things being equal, I think we know whose voting record would be more like John Cornyn's. But that, to them, I think early on when they made this decision, it was more of a pragmatic view. Look, most people watching politics in May, when Charlie Crist decided to run, didn't believe we'd get this far, much less have a chance to win. I think things have changed since then. I think they misread the direction this country was headed. I think, quite frankly, the fact of the matter is that the majority of Americans and the mainstream of American political life find themselves at the center right. That's where the mainstream of America is.
Well, and, Marco, we had a poll that we showed this morning on Morning Joe. Gallup came out with a new poll, showed 40% of Americans said they were conservative. Only 20% of Americans said they were liberal. 36% said they were moderate. So you've got 76% of Americans saying they're either conservative or moderate, and yet Republicans got thrashed the past 2 times. Isn't that an indictment on George W. Bush and the Republicans that ran Washington over the past 8 years? They just spent way too much money.
Well, I mean, if you look at 94 and the contract with America and all the things it promised, and then you looked at the fact that Republicans controlled all 3 branches, or both, key branches of government, policymaking branches for the better part of 6 years, we still don't have term limits. We still don't have a balanced budget amendment. We don't still have, the contract remains unfulfilled. And the result is that at some point, Republicans in Washington stopped being about ideas and started being about fundraising and running campaign commercials to win. And when you became about that, that was the end.
So how can you, Marco Rubio, guarantee conservatives, 40% of Americans, that when you go to Washington, you won't change just like everybody else?
Yeah. Well, here's 2 things. First, I have a record. I mean, I was Speaker of the House my last 2 years, and I had to live through those years where people were coming up to me and saying, why are you so center-right? Don't you know those years are over? Being conservative isn't cool anymore. The new wave is this moderate-type positioning, and you're too ideological and so forth, and we stood up against that. And quite frankly, it led to a lot of battles with Charlie Crist. He was governor, and I was Speaker. The second is just the nature of this race. So many people run for office because they want to be somebody. They want a title. And I can assure you that if I wanted to be somebody, I could have picked an easier race than this one. I know I'm running for the right reasons. I know I'm running because I want to do something, because otherwise I wouldn't be in this race. I mean, if what I wanted was a title next to my name, I'd run for something else. There was a bunch of other things I could have run for.
Yeah.
And, in fact, I was approached about that by some in the establishment. So, look, there's never any guarantees. I just know this. In my sense, I'm pretty comfortable about it. A, I'm running for the right reasons, and that alone is a big deal. And B, I have a record of standing up for my principles, despite perhaps being on the wrong side of the, certain the fad of the moment in the political winds.
Is Charlie Crist a conservative?
No, I don't think you can call him a conservative.
Is he a moderate?
I think Charlie, quite frankly, often is motivated by public opinion more than he is by principle. I think most of that was my experience as Speaker. What the plan he supported for property tax reform was based on polling. It wasn't based on public policy. I think if you look at his embrace of the stimulus package, I think that was based on the fact that Barack Obama was very popular at the time in February. And the need to get out of a tough budget here in Florida. Yeah. I think, quite frankly, much of his positioning on issues is based on public opinion, and that's why, just like public opinion moves, that's why his position on issues move. And I think you can always find where he's going to be on an issue from what the polling says. When someone says, and so I think that's problematic, because we have too much of that in American politics already.
Okay. All right, Marco Rubio, thank you so much for being with us. We really do appreciate it, and good luck out there.
Thank you.